I'm Steve Croft.
I'm Leslie Stahl.
I'm Bob Simon.
I'm Morley Safer.
I'm Scott Pelley. Those stories and Andy Rooney tonight on 60 Minutes.
My name is Alexander Stelbecki, and in this edition of what we hope to be 8 minutes or less, we begin tonight with a conflict that is labeled to have lasted 13 days. On the verge of nuclear warfare, 3 prominent leaders were in a conflict to the protection and rights of Cuba. The conflict was labeled as the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962. John F. Kennedy, Fidel Castro, and Nikita Khrushchev, leaders of the countries in conflict, were trying to straighten out the situation with the Cuban government. Fidel Castro leaned towards becoming what the United States labeled as a communist government due to their economic negotiations with the Soviet Union as to lower dependency on the United States relations. Assistance from the United States from that point on was cut, and the Soviet Union aided Cuba, be it from sugar cane profits or other sources. The United States and Soviet tensions only grew from there. In 1959, after a 6-year-long revolution, President Fulgencio Batista flees Cuba after Fidel Castro's continuous attempts at assuming control. Castro assumes power after proclaiming victory in Santiago, and, by February 2, 1959, Cuba declares Fidel Castro to be the new premier and president of Cuba. Just a month later, on October 20, 1959, Turkey and the United States agreed to deploy 15 nuclear-tipped Jupiter missiles in Turkey, starting on June 1, 1961. The deployment was later recognized by the Soviet Union and was considered a negative aspect. Castro, on May 7, 1960, when he couldn't find support in the United States, instead found support in the Soviet Union. Cuba and the Soviet Union established diplomatic relations. The United States recognized the talks and negotiations between the Soviet Union and Cuba and its foreign aid programs to Cuba. On April 17, 1961, with U.S. direction, training, and support, a group of about 1,400 Cubans attempted an invasion of Cuba at the Bay of Pigs. Cuban government aircraft pinned the invasion force on the beachhead. Without additional supplies of ammunition, the invaders were quickly crushed by Cuban ground forces. 114 were killed, and about 1,000 were captured. In response to the invasion, Fidel Castro orders the arrest of some 200,000 suspected dissidents to prevent an internal uprising. Not long after, Cuba publicly stated that it would become a social republic. Operation Mongoose was initiated in order to stop the communist government and take Castro out of power, any means necessary. The CIA tried to disperse Castro in different ways, be it poisoning or other forms of taking down economics. But in 1962, a U.S. spy plane spotted bombs in Cuba. After further review, the U.S. found that the bombs were belonging to the Soviet Union. During this time period, we were lucky enough to have Khrushchev answer a question for us. So Khrushchev, do you think the United States in any way provoked the Soviet Union in wanting to install nuclear missiles in Cuba?
Yeah, maybe just a lot. They placed nuclear missiles in Turkey as well as Italy. That was a great strategic advantage over us. Even if we both have nuclear capabilities, it just made it an unfair playing field. I mean, our missiles cannot reach them nearly as easily. The U.S. have placed them right on our border, whereas we would have to find a way to get them near the United States unnoticed. But that was prior to our foreign relations with Cuba, who now allow us a new place to establish our missiles, which gives us an equal playing field with the United States, considering we could have nuked their capital. So for that reason, it was strategically smart of us to place the missiles in Cuba. That way we could have an equal threat to each other, causing a stalemate.
The starting of a 13-day period in which mutually assured destruction was probable started after this point, and talk between Khrushchev and Kennedy took place. Talks of solving the problem seemed to be improbable, but after a somewhat thorough discussion, Kennedy and Khrushchev were able to meet a conclusion. With the promise that the United States would remove their missiles from Turkey and assure the Soviet Union that they wouldn't invade Cuba, the missiles were removed from Cuba. The chances seem slim now that the bombing would take place, but during the 13-day period, it is a probable case of mutually assured destruction. We have been given the luck during this segment to ask Kennedy and Castro questions pertaining to the Cuban Missile Crisis.
What motives do you think the Soviet Union had to give Cuba nuclear missiles?
As Naval has stated before now, knowing the circumstances to what the situation was, I'd like to view that they were helping our cause due to our call for help. But they also had their own problems they needed to solve. To put it straight, they helped us as well as help themselves on a fight against the Yankees. I think they really used threatening to stop the US from putting nuclear missiles any closer to the Soviet borders, and they needed to threaten them so they wouldn't contest my power with Cuba. is literally in the end beneficial to both sides, as able to have American influence out of Cuba, and the Soviet Union was able to have missiles removed from the Turkey. In the end, though, Cuba does not want to be a pawn on the world's chessboard. Do you think that by the United States performing the Bay of Pigs invasion, Operation Mongoose, and by placing nuclear missiles in Turkey, it provoked the Soviet Union to place nuclear missiles in Cuba?
Well, I'd like to think the Soviets saw these acts as measures only to secure and protect the United States. There's a possibility that the Bay of Pigs invasion, Operation Mongoose, as well as placing nuclear missiles in Turkey, could have provoked the Soviet Union to place nuclear missiles in Cuba. I could see that happening because by having the U.S. trying to overthrow Castro in both the Bay of Pigs invasion and in Operation Mongoose, it provoked Cuba, which caused them to ask the Soviet Union for further support in their defense against us. The Soviet Union could then use this window of opportunity to appear not only as a good ally, but to use their new position of nuclear missiles to threaten the U.S. if they use their missiles in Turkey.
This is Alexander Stelbecki, and we won't be back next week with another edition of 8 Minutes or Less. Good night.